There you go. So yeah, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining yet another research discussion from Open Digital Health. My name is Sebastian Potthoff, and I am one of the directors of Open Digital Health, and you will have seen me here facilitating these events. It's really nice to see everybody. Today we bring a really nice event to you. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Claire Garnett, who is a senior research fellow at UCL in the Tobacco and Alcohol Research Group. She's a behavioral scientist with a background in health psychology. And her research has a focus on digital alcohol interventions, and she has built a substantial program of work on the development and evaluation of an alcohol reduction app, Drink Less, which she will be discussing today, and which she is at the moment finalizing a large RCT on, and we were just talking about that. So yeah, we will have Claire's presentation, and following the presentation, there will be opportunity to dive into a discussion. So just hold off with your questions for now, and then once the presentation is finished, you can either engage via the chat or you can unmute yourself as well. So at this point, I would like to hand it over to Claire. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sebastian. I'm just gonna, hopefully, we have practiced this. Can you now see my slides full screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Then it has worked. Yeah, so thanks so much for having me today. As Sebastian said, I'm going to discuss the potential challenges and consequences of making app code open source from our experience with the Drink Less app, which we developed at UCL. The talk's going to include our decision-making process to make it open source, our experience of the process, and yeah, what we learned as a result. And then, yeah, followed by a discussion with all of you, which I'm looking forward to. So just before going any further, I'd like to acknowledge our funders, the team behind all of this work, and our app developers, all of whom this wouldn't have been possible without, and my declaration of interest that I have been done some paid scientific consultancy work for the behaviour change and lifestyle organisation 1 Year No Beer, which involves providing fact checking for their blog posts. So I thought first up, it might be helpful just to provide a brief bit of background on myself and the research that I'll be talking from today, so you sort of know the perspective that I'm coming from. So as they said, I'm a behavioural scientist with a background in health psychology. My PhD, which I started back in 2013, had the aim of developing and conducting an initial evaluation of an alcohol reduction app, which we call Drink Less. And before this, I had no experience of working with a digital health tool. The development of the first version of the app started in 2014 and was a 2-year process. And our funders supported making the app open source and free at the point of use. It was then launched on the App Store in May 2016. And we then went on to refine the app to improve its likely usability and effectiveness. And this occurred between 2018 and 2019. And this was a multi-stage mixed methods research project that had, as I said, different stages aimed sort of differently at improving usability through user testing, for example, and its effectiveness based on the initial evaluation that we conducted on the first version of the app. And then, as Seb alluded to, since March 2020, we have been evaluating the app in a large randomized controlled trial to evaluate both its effectiveness and cost effectiveness at reducing alcohol consumption among increasing and higher risk drinkers in the UK. So my experience around open source app code is solely from being involved in the development and refinement of the Drink Less app. And so, yeah, I'm aware that this is just my perspective on the challenges and consequences from doing so, and look forward to hearing others' experiences of this as well. Throughout the whole process, we have tried to take an open science approach to our research, sort of beyond just the having open source app code. So this has included open anonymized data and source code, pre-registered protocols, relevant study materials, brief reports, and published papers, as well as the freely available software, the app itself on the App Store. All of the relevant published papers, protocols, anonymized data and syntax is available on our Open Science Framework page. I've included a link to there, but if you search Open Science Framework and search for Drink Less, you'll find it there. And we've also published both the development of version 1 and the refinement version 2 processes as 2 separate open access research papers. And I mean, I suppose sort of preaching to the choir here, but you know, an open science approach to research means that our research can be part of a much larger collaborative effort beyond just our immediate team or institute, and is really important for scientific progress. And also by following these principles, we can help avoid unnecessary waste and reduce development costs for other researchers. Which leads on to why we should make our app code open source. And the rationale and sort of some of the reasons behind why we chose to do this. While I was thinking about this and preparing this talk, sort of the reasons kind of fell into both sort of more altruistic and slightly maybe more selfish reasons. So I'm going to start with some of the ones that I considered maybe more altruistic reasons for doing so. And as I just mentioned, the principles of open science are crucial for efficient scientific progress, and means that all of our efforts can go towards one larger collaborative effort rather than working in silos and duplicating effort and resources and costs. And this was our key driver for making the Drink Less app code open source. It also means that it's cheaper for other researchers and developers to create their own interventions. You can use components of the app, or you could change the target behavior or the target audience, all at a fraction of the cost compared with if you were just starting from scratch. And this is really important, as while digital health tools have got the advantage of being low cost, sort of a critical point here is it's low cost once they're developed. So it's, you know, there's a low incremental cost to then deliver that tool to many more people, but they can be prohibitively expensive to develop in the first place. And by making app code open source, you can help to remove this barrier or at least lower it a bit. And sort of, again, reading around this, sort of open source is being widely considered as the future, and in some cases the present, given how common it already is. Big companies use open source software. I hadn't realized this, but for example, Microsoft have put their primary development framework as open source. And it's how sort of modern organizations and companies build software. And ideally, we would want to keep pace with this. And then the final reason on this slide is sort of to give back. So in our case, our app development was funded by money from charities like the Society for the Study of Addiction and Cancer Research UK, and also from public money from National Institute of Health and Care Research. So it seems only right and fair, to me anyway, that the end result of their money is also freely available. And then now on to some more reasons that maybe fall into the slightly selfish rather than altruistic camp. There's the advantage of transparency, that it shows others that you've got nothing to hide and potentially increases the likelihood of whatever it is that you've developed is being considered credible. You can also end up with far better quality code. So if your app code is open source, then others can check and comment on your code, therefore improving it. I would say this is a possible upside and not one that we've experienced, because I think it probably depends on how much your code is used. But you know, that is an upside that some people do experience and a reason to do it. And there is a law that I didn't know of until preparing this talk, but Linus's law says that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow when it comes to software development. So with more people working on it and checking it, you're likely to have less bugs, or at least less sort of severe bugs, and better quality code. Another, I suppose, sort of broader benefit of open science, but if you know that the code is going to be public, you're also likely to end up with better code because it needs to be written clearly and with simple documentation. So in our case, this is something that we had to ask our app developers to go back and do retrospectively at times to make sure that it was clear for other people to look at. And this is not only worth doing for other people, but also, for your future self when you go back and maybe years down the line, re-engage with that source code. Making your app code open source also could mean that it's more widely used via different platforms. It reduces duplication of effort, which I know I've mentioned already under my sort of list of loosely altruistic reasons. But I suppose the flip side, that maybe some more selfish thing, is that you can benefit from the being open source app code, and you can reduce your own effort and your own costs. And it could be that a new component you want to incorporate into your app has already been developed and designed for another app, and you can sort of translate it into your own. And it can also translate into goodwill and good advertising for you and your app. That, when I've given talks previously about the development of the Drink Less app, and if I mention, or when I mention that the source code is open source, there's always been a very positive response to that, which again is, could be a reason to decide to make your app code open source. And then onto the concerns. So I suppose my full disclosure is that we haven't really experienced many, if any, challenges from making the app open source, and potentially that is due to, as I sort of alluded to before, how many other people have started to use it. The concern I'm going to start with is the one that I think is most common, and that is the idea that somebody might copy your app and create an exact replica. And if somebody does this, it could dilute your digital health tool. Though I suppose on the other side, you've still got sort of your branding, your existing users, and the question maybe of, how much does it matter, and would it not just be a good thing if more people accessed your intervention, even if it was in a different app? One way of tracking this to see how it's used is to include a citation for your app code, so you can more easily track who uses it and how, and also include a license, which I'm going to talk a bit more about on next slide. Another potential concern could be around the time involved. So as I said, it does require additional time in terms of making sure that the code is well documented and clearly written. And particularly if the decision to make it open source comes at the end of the project and somebody needs to go back and do this, potentially even more time consuming than if you knew from the start that you were going to be making the app code open source, and therefore you could do it as you went along. We, as I sort of showed on the acknowledgement slide, we had professional app developers for the development and the refinement of the Drink Less app. And given that there was time involved in uploading the code to GitHub and to check everything was in working order, we had to pay them for their time, which is money that you then can't use for development, albeit not a sort of significant amount. And then there's the admin of maintaining up-to-date online records and archives of the app code. And if you release the app code to the public rather than all of the code being open source as we do, so sort of we've got 2 repositories on GitHub, one which is the working one, and then when we get to a point where the app is relatively stable or like major versions, so version 1, version 2, those that app code is then released open source and archived. And yeah, so the next reason, a potential loss of profit related to the issue of duplicates. So if the software that you're developing is not freely available and then profit is involved, then I suppose making your app code open source is potentially more complicated, as it might then limit your opportunity for monetization. Which initially, I suppose, you can maybe think this is unimportant when compared with the principles of open science. But there is something to be said about thinking about and planning for the longevity of an intervention and how these costs will be covered. One of our app developers once said to me, he said that people often think about developing an app as if you're buying a nice picture for your house, and that you bought the picture and then you put it on the wall and it's just there looking lovely forever. And he's like, it's actually far more like having a house plant, that you buy it and it does require constant maintenance and topping up of water and pruning or whatever. And actually, if you don't do that, the tool will die. So depending on what the the business model is for the app and how it will be maintained, profit and making money from the app potentially might be important for the longevity of it. And yeah, so there's that flip side. And then I think there's also the flip side of transparency, which is potential security risk and the possibility of hackers discovering security flaws more easily. And I suppose the size of this concern depends on the data that you have and whether that's anonymous. And if it's not anonymous, you know, is it sort of personal data, special category data, that the extent to which that is considered a risk. And then finally, that you could lose control over the code and app. But again, you can use a license to then have some of this sort of back and within your control. So yeah, onto the process. I suppose the first step I think that's most important is choosing a license. So there's hundreds of different licenses that you could use. And these fall into two main categories. You've got permissive and copyleft. So permissive licenses place very little restriction on how others can use the source code and reshare your software. And a common example of this license is MIT, where somebody else can essentially do anything with the software as long as they include the original copyright from yours and license notice in the copy of the software. And then the other type of licenses, copyleft licenses, and this requires that anyone who releases a modified open source program must also release the source code for that program. So this type of license generally allows users to change and reshare your creation as long as they also include their source code for others too. So the copyleft license is what we chose, and it effectively sort of means that others can use the code, but you're ensuring that if your code is then used by somebody else, that other people will benefit from that change. So it's created to sort of protect software from becoming private, and maintaining and sort of encouraging that to continue. And yeah, a common example of that is the general public license. And this basically means any copy or any modification to the original code must also be released under a general public license, which is what we did. And then creating a repository. So we used GitHub and then Zenodo to archive the major releases. And we update this public repository every time there's a major version change, which has, in our case, just been the 2 times. And then the consequences. And as you can see from my rainbow imagery, I'm focusing on the positive consequences here, of which I think the most and the ones that we've experienced anyway. That the field of digital health is going to progress quicker, which is something that I think all of us here anyway want. That your app is more likely to be widely used, your development paper might be more widely cited. There's a potential knock-on effect of encouraging others to do the same, particularly if they want to use your code and you've used a copyleft license. And it will also enable evidence-based intervention content to be used and translated into different contexts much more easily with a sort of much lower threshold in terms of the resource required. Yeah, and sort of to reiterate here that while people have expressed interest in the fact that the app code for Drink Less is open source, I sort of recently checked the citations and we're not aware of anyone actually using this code as a basis of or part of another app. And sort of finally, I suppose that maybe we'll end up with a library of freely available apps and their open source code that is clearly documented for users, researchers, practitioners, and basically everybody to search for and access, which I think we can probably all agree is a good thing. And then, yeah, sort of onto discussion points, I suppose a couple of things that I thought might be interesting to discuss. Firstly, just it would be really interesting to hear other people's experiences of this, if you have or have not made app code open source. And something that I was thinking while I was writing this talk was about, you know, how, if at all, do the challenges and benefits of making app code open source differ from the challenges and benefits of open science principles, such as making anonymized data or syntax openly available, and are there sort of unique characteristics in that? But yeah, thank you for listening. And yeah, any questions or yeah, it'd be great to have a discussion with you all. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Claire. Brilliant overview, very nice presentation. So thank you very much for that. I think it will provoke some thoughts and ideas from the rest of the audience. So I'd invite anybody who would like to respond and share their experiences maybe. Aminul, I hope I say that correctly. Would you like to come in?
This is Aminul Islam.
Aminul Islam, welcome.
Thank you, Claire Garnett. Thanks for your nice presentation. So I'm working as an assistant professor in Bangladesh University of Health Science, Department of Health Informatics. So, if you allow me, I have a couple of questions. Number one, you did not basically provide in Android platform your mobile apps, only Apple. So sorry, I could not able to test the app. So do you have any, my first question is, do you have any plan to launch in the Android app so that widely people can use it? Another question is, what was the result of your RCT, randomized control trial? I mean, after, the apps, I basically take your visualization of your apps and it sounds great to me. It looks good. So the two questions, and in the similar, in Bangladesh, I have also developed apps on tobacco cessation in Bengali language, basically. So that I have experience on that a little bit. So I am just curious to hear from you that what was your result in randomized control trial, and do you have any future plan to launch in Android so that I can use it or I can check it? Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. I'm going to answer them in the opposite order because the second one will relate to the first. So we are just coming to the end of data collection. So we will be analysing the data come towards the end of November, December. And we're actually going to be having a stakeholder summit event in February, which is going to be in London, but it's going to be a hybrid one so people can attend online as well. So I might, I'll see you, and potentially I can send the invite around this group. We're just finalising the invitation at the moment if people would like to attend. So I can't share the results of the trial yet because I don't know them. And I suppose that then comes on to the Android version. So when we were developing the app, there was a limited budget. And so there were sort of decisions around, do we make a sort of pared back version of the app that is available on both platforms? Or do we invest and make sure that we've got one sort of stronger, better, more user-friendly, better designed app? And we went for the latter, evidently, because it's not available on Android, on the basis that we didn't want to get to the end of a trial and kind of the results almost be along the lines of, well, maybe the content would have been affected had people used it, and it was because it was buggy or because there were sort of issues in fragmentation, which can happen more with Android. So we made the decision to develop it on one platform, and we chose iOS again because of these issues with fragmentation. So with Android apps, there tend to be there's more different types of phones and more different softwares. And so there is more likely to be bugs related to how that is to an app. We would like to have an Android version. The tricky thing is that we, up to this point anyway, have been funded by research grants and through projects. And I agree that research funders shouldn't be funding basically creating a duplicate version of an app, particularly if we don't know if it's effective. So this randomized controlled trial is, I suppose, more of sort of, proof of concept. And if it is effective in on this platform, it's very good evidence and good reasons and rationale to then sort of fundraise or apply for funding to create an Android version. So it is something that we are aware of quite regularly. We get emails from users asking about Android versions, but it is just something that we haven't had the money to do. And based on the fact that no one in our team has, none of us are app developers. So potentially if you had that level of expertise within your team, then maybe that would be something that you could have done. But yeah, sort of the path that we went down with the first decision back in sort of 2014, 2015 has meant that we're now just evaluating it. It's currently only available on the Apple App Store. But hopefully, depending on the results of the trial, if we find that it's effective, then there will be an Android version.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. I hand it over to Ian.
I think you're on mute, Ian.
Now, I wonder if you could reflect on your experience in working with open source app developers and the extent to which you think the code will be genuinely reusable. And I say that because we have an IHR grant where we developed an intervention to support people with comorbid severe mental illness and type 2 diabetes. And the app developer said everything would be all open source. For various reasons, we fell out with that app developer and they gave us all their source code. And the new companies came along and went, we wouldn't touch that with a barge pole and we'll start again. And it felt to us like people's kind of core product might be open source, but in reality, they're using a bunch of proprietary libraries and systems to kind of create stuff that goes into that. So in fact, nothing is reusable practically. So I wonder if you could kind of reflect on that kind of process.
Yeah, really, really interesting question and very good point. So we had sort of two, they were connected, but there was a sort of a shift from one set of app developers that were more involved with the initial development and then with the refinement. And they had previously worked together. So they were able to have conversations that basically said, what on earth is this? And, you know, thank you for bringing it up because I maybe should have mentioned the talk, but the initial development of the app, we did a factorial trial. So there were 5 intervention components and we had each of those intervention components as standalone that you could switch on or off and people were randomized to. So the current app developer does often say, he's like, this is the most complicated app that I've ever worked on. And I don't think that's because of the level of complexity in the app, but the level of complexity in the code that is now embedded in the code and almost a bit late. So I completely get your point, and I think that is potentially also one of the reasons that maybe people haven't used it is because it's, whilst it is well documented, that, you know, there is a lot of sort of legacy code in there that now isn't being used, that is just being permanently switched off, but is still got links to. And it sort of reminds me of people when they talk about, like, if you were to start developing like the London transport system now, there is no way you would design it as is. It's just not functional. But London is a bit too far down the line, so you've got to work with what you've got. So I think, and that I suppose sort of goes to what you were saying about your second sort of access to app developers, and just saying, actually, from our point of view, it is easier to start fresh. So it's a really good point. I think potentially as researchers, we could take a more active role in ensuring that it will be open source in a usable way. I struggle with that because that's, you know, I can't, I think, you know, sometimes when I look and I can see him doing the app code, it's like I can work out which bit of the app that it's talking about, but I am not a coder and so can't tell. I, you know, take it on trust that it would be usable to another app developer. And, you know, we do pay him to make, you know, do the documentation and things like that. So, but similarly, I think if, you know, we've had conversations because we are thinking about the, you know, the longevity and the sustainability of the app. And, you know, we are a group of researchers and our skills are not in maintaining technology, and were sort of another organization or somebody to take it on. You know, I remember having conversations and sort of their tech person saying, we would probably start again, like not in terms of the app, but like the code, the back end, because it was like, we'd just like it to be a bit neater. So while it, as you say, like while it's there and it's available, how usable it is to other people when your primary focus is different. So when we first developed the app, the primary focus was this trial, and that was the, you know, the decision making around that was all to that end. And now we've, you know, when we've got to the point where, okay, we've released this version and we're making this open source, when we were developing, you know, when the app developer was writing the code, the thing that we cared about was this randomization and the on-off system, not how easy is this going to be for somebody else to read. So I think it's, you know, maybe that needs to be something that we start thinking about earlier on in the journey of digital health tools, in the same way that I think we should be thinking about the longevity and the sustainability beyond the end of a funded project. But you know, how much resource are you putting into, and should you be putting some resource separately into, you know, making sure that the app, the source code is usable to people?
Great question, I think. Just following up on that before I hand it over to Felix, I was wondering, since you are making everything sort of openly available, I guess there are two questions. Have you had conversations with other app developers that have consequently drawn on that code that you've made available to sort of learn from that, integrate that into their own solutions? And at the same time, also, when your app developer was developing the Drink Less app, were they drawing on some of other people's code to do that? I mean, you might not know that, but have you had conversations, I suppose, with people who would be interested in certain components of the code?
The second, I'm not sure, I haven't actually spoken to the app developer about that. It would be really interesting, and next time I do speak to him, I'll ask. So I'm not sure the extent to which other code, you know, we did use sort of libraries of other openly available images for some of the images on the app and things like that, but specifically with the code, I'm not sure. And then, sorry, my mind's gone. Your first question?
No, the question is, I suppose, if then other people have used some of your code to sort of inform their interventions. Because yeah, we put the code out there, I suppose. I mean, I'm not so experienced with that part, but and then we hope that it will, you know, help other people with their own digital solutions. But is that just an assumption, or, you know, do you have experience with people actually approaching you and trying to do that?
I agree with you that I think it is an assumption that it will be helpful. We have had conversations where people have definitely asked for, you know, can you share the link, or have looked at it, and, you know, sort of design elements have been used. But I think, again, sort of, you know, to Ian's point, I think I suppose making it open source doesn't necessarily mean you're making it usable. And so I think what we've done is made it open source. But I suppose, you know, the barrier of cost and resources isn't there in terms of the code, but maybe it is there in terms of actually people being able to use it. But there definitely has been interest in, you know, if you wanted to translate the app into a different language, or, you know, currently it's only available in the UK, and that's because around some of the, you know, drinking guidelines and things like that that are specific to the UK, it would be quite easy to go in and just change those elements maybe for the country, but you would then still have all of this other legacy code going on. So there is interest in it, but the sort of pickup rate isn't that high. But then I don't know if that's to do with sort of how specific the tool is maybe. And again, I think more widely, do people know? And, you know, if we had this library of like, these are all these digital health tools and all of these links to the repository where you can access the data, maybe that would be easier. And, you know, a sort of list of these are the main components that you could find if you wanted, you know, images of it. So I suppose maybe the only people that know that it's open source are people who are very interested in digital alcohol interventions, and people who are, you know, smoking cessation interventions maybe haven't read the paper and don't know that it's open source and it exists. So yeah, but a really good point.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is something that we are interested in at Open Digital Health, about the, so you're making almost a pitch for us about this searchable database that some of my colleagues are, well, we're all working on to produce that. So I hand it over to Felix.
Thanks, a really interesting conversation. I have lots of questions, but I'll limit it to one just for now. We were in a position where we were keen to make again a similar kind of app, a smoking cessation app in this case, open source, but we got quite a bit of pushback from our contracts department and our university tech transfer department, and the funder as well, who's the same funder as yours for your ideas trial. Now this was maybe a little bit before you started, I think, the funding for your project, but not that different in time. So did you have conversations like that with your university or the funder? Were they a bit unsure about open source code, and how did you kind of get around that?
Really good question. And I suppose we sort of went a bit under the radar. So the funder was in favour of the principles of open science. And so I think it was part of the sort of the pitch, and it's that, we should, in the same way that we're making the app freely available, we should make the code freely available, we should make everything that you've funded usable to other people. So that, to my knowledge anyway, potentially other people in the team, because at this point I do my PhD, so potentially those conversations happened between other people that I wasn't privy to. In terms of the university, I think it's quite interesting because basically at the point in which the university got involved, it already was open source. So, they asked about intellectual property, and with this new trial, with the randomized control trial, this 3-year project, the contracts team were asking about, what is the intellectual property? But it's like, well, the source code is, the app code is open source, sorry. And therefore, the intellectual property then became sort of like, it was, I think, background IP. And it was basically like, the team's know-how in relation to using it, but the actual app itself wasn't considered intellectual property. But as I said, I think potentially we've got around that because it sort of happened before they were involved. And yeah, the funder was in favour of it, or at least not against it when we said that that's what we were planning on doing. But I think it is, I suppose it comes back to that issue around monetization and who's planning on, are you planning on earning money from it? And that was very much never, again, sort of the setup with the funder. And so I think it fit with the general kind of ethos behind the project that then meant maybe it wasn't, I don't know, but potentially they're not thinking about it in quite the same level of, detail. If it's not coming up as this one issue, but it's just part of a broader plan to make everything open source and, isn't open science great? And we'll do this, 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 and this, and this. And one of those things is we'll make the source code, the app code open source, and on we go. And they say, yes, great idea. So I think we potentially, avoided it that way. And that now when, contracts team or IP, it was already open source, and therefore the conversations are about, what do they kind of own and have, as intellectual property within UCL, and then that becomes the know-how of the team, which I suppose to other people's previous questions is then important, actually considering potentially how usable the code is, which sadly I don't know because I can't write code, but I suppose that kind of feeds in. But that's really interesting. What was the result of your conversations then with the university?
Well, we went with it not being open source code, just because I think it was so the way you've laid it out, you make a really good point in that in our case we were planning to do some further development work, so some foreground IP within the project. So I think you've made you were in a good position because you'd done all that development work before that sort of funded project, so they wouldn't have the rights to that background IP anyway. In our case, it was a bit different, and so I think it was just a lack of awareness. And they just didn't really understand open source code and the implications for that. And clearly from today's session, there are still things that we don't fully understand in terms of what the kind of what the consequences will be, and how often is the code reusable, and some of these other potential risks and potential benefits. How often do these occur? What would be really interesting and useful, I think, would be to almost have a kind of a reassuring summary of the implications of making open, source code open, and that could be used for when there is potentially pushback from tech transfer organizations within universities and funders and so on, where the knee-jerk reaction is to say no, just because it sounds like a risk, more of a risk than just saying let's just contain it and not make it publicly accessible and all the rest of it. So I think that would be a really useful thing to be able to provide and say, look, there's some really good reasons for making it open source, and look, here you go, and you know, let's have a conversation about it. So thank you, that's really helpful response.
No, yeah, well, I'll because we definitely had to respond to, I think it was like the UCL contracts team and to NIHR, the funder for that, in terms of the IP, and I can't remember exactly the extent to which, but I'd be very happy to share that. And to be honest, I'd add it onto the Drink Less Open Science Framework page, because I agree in terms of like knowing the best way to respond. And I think, you know, there's something to be said from, and again, how you sort of incorporate this, but considering it is the norm with big companies, it sort of feels like if big companies don't think it is a risk in terms of profit, we don't need to worry. You know, we never were wanting to make money out of the Drink Less app. So it, you know, potentially my quite sort of naive, simplistic view of it is like, well, why does it matter if other people are used? Like, I just don't understand why that would be a problem. I think, you know, if they were then copying it in terms of pretending to then be the same app, but had kind of gone in and changed it in a way that then wasn't evidence-based, that then maybe is concerning. But you wouldn't be able to, because, you know, you wouldn't be able to name the app Drink Less because there is already an app called Drink Less in the App Store. So things like that, I think, kind of contain those issues. But yeah, I think the dealing with how other people view it, yeah, it's a kind of learning curve. And again, I think is definitely one for us to share knowledge on, so that people don't have to do it each for the first time themselves.
Great. I have a question.
Mhm.
Because just relating to one of my projects where we're going through similar sort of decisions, and you've touched on it on the upkeep of the app. So I'll ask a direct question. I'm wondering, you don't have to answer it, but it's a two-part question. The first one is, how much does it cost to upkeep this app in particular, and what is sort of your plan for, you know, the long-term upkeep? You know, who will pay that cost to? I don't know if it's a company that does it for you or just a one-person sort of job. But is it the university or the charity funders, or who is it that will pay that? If it is effective, I suppose they want to see that, of course.
So the maintenance is, I suppose it's a bit of a tricky one, because I think there's like two parts of maintenance. There's maintenance when new software gets launched on the iPhone and therefore a new bug comes in, or it's something like, you know, the way that you enter dates has changed. So then it's just not consistent with the rest of a phone. And so therefore it makes sense to change the way that you would, you know, scroll through time, for example, on an iPhone anyway. We budgeted, I think it was £10,000 for 3 years, basically, to maintain the app over that period, and also to make some changes for the trial. So most of the time, the app data is collected as anonymous. In the context of the trial, we wanted to be able to link people's usage so that we could look at engagement data with that. So people sign up, they give consent, but there's also a screen asking them, you know, if you're taking part in this study, can you enter your email address so that we can link you to your trial records? So that was part of it. So there are those costs. Again, it's that thing where incrementally for additional users, it is relatively low. And then in terms of the long-term plan, as I sort of alluded to earlier, it was never something that we thought about at the outset. And it's something that we started thinking about at the end, well, I suppose more with at the end of the refinement process, so back in 2019. And I suppose anecdotally, I remember reading a user review of somebody saying, like, oh, you know, the last version released was over a year ago. The developers have clearly forgotten about this app. And so, you know, being aware, like, that some users anyway are aware of the responsiveness of developers and what they expect from that. So when we were applying for funding to do this randomized control trial, part of what we applied for was also some money. There's a organisation, Evidence to Impact, a not-for-profit organisation that are based in Bristol. And they have been writing sort of a sustainability business model for us. So different options of ways of maintaining the app and sort of beyond the end of the trial. As you said, who's interested in taking it on will depend whether or not it is found to be effective, if we detect an effect. So if we don't detect an effect, it's, you know, and rightly so, it would be strange if you know, health kind of organizations, or whether that's, you know, Office for Health, you know, whoever it is, sort of taking it on and maintaining it is different. There's sort of, you know, people are interested in the app, but I think we as a team need to wait until we know what the results are. And as part of the sort of report, they were thinking, you know, a kind of working group working out what the plan is. And there were many different options about trying to sort of get some kind of collective together of sort of various organizations that all contribute a bit of money towards its maintenance, or whether you find somebody to take on the day-to-day running of that, but that you still maintain kind of scientific oversight of it. So it's something that we're still working through, and we'll happily report back, but I don't have much more to say at this point.
No, but it's interesting, just your thought process, like that you actually have somebody who you're consulting with that can help you with that, and then, you know, actually thinking that through, because it is such an issue that we all sort of face in this process. Ian.
I think I've made sure I've unmuted this time. Claire, kind of following on from Sebastian's question, with our first app that we developed as part of a program grant, we didn't think through the kind of long-term hosting arrangements, and much like it sounds you are, we're over a barrel to the developer for kind of the hosting and kind of ongoing maintenance charges for the trial. With a subsequent program grant that we've got, where we've got a charity partner who's kind of come on, we discussed their kind of hosting requirements and kind of what technologies they had when developing the app, so that we could kind of pass it on to them. Have you kind of thought through what the hosting requirements would be for the system that you're the app that you've developed, and what was your kind of discussions with the developer around the kind of practicalities of hosting and maintaining that app?
Yes, so we have, stop me by the way if I've misinterpreted what your question is, or any of those points. So we the app is sort of hosted on Pass, which is in itself an open source system that people contribute to and maintain. So our app developer sort of suggested, it's like, you know, it might be that you want to, or I think at the point at which Pass maybe shifted, and I think it sort of got, I can't remember exactly, but I think like NodeChef sort of took over from Pass as this hosting platform. And then there was talk of whether or not it would make sense to then shift, but basically the community of Pass users have taken the mantle on and are now maintaining it, and therefore it's sort of, we've kept it on that platform. In terms of hosting charges and things like that with the data, that's been through accounts that we have held sort of somebody within the team. So we have autonomy in the decision-making process in terms of the hosting, but do similarly take a lot of advice and from the app developer who knows about these things, as probably in the way that I have unarticulately answered your question. That is not my skill set. So when he tells me that the community is, you know, that Pass is going to be a goer and don't need to worry about it anymore, you know, I take his word for that. But yeah, I think it's, again, something that I maybe hadn't thought of. And again, you know, apps, there is a low incremental cost, but the more users you get, so we collect, every time somebody looks at a new screen and there's a new row of data, which is incredible in terms of like the level of granularity that we can see about how people engage with the app. But you cannot download that onto an Excel file. Like, it's enormous. And so it's, the more users we get, that's brilliant. But we are, you know, the level of data required and therefore the hosting packages, you know, it does increase in that sense. And we have the ability within the sort of research grants that we have to pay for that. But again, I suppose it feeds into like longer term, who would take on that I think it would be relatively easy to switch it to, but it's just, again, something that we hadn't, or I hadn't anyway, speak for myself here, considered. You know, to be fair, when we first developed the app, we also didn't think we'd have anywhere near as many users as we now do. Like, so it's good that it is bigger, but when it does get bigger, it does get, you know, marginally more expensive because you are also storing that level of data.
That answered my question perfectly. I think it's something that it feels like we're all kind of stumbling into blind, and it's really useful to have these discussions. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Oh no. Well, yeah, it's been a really interesting discussion with all of you. So yeah, I agreed in terms of the it feels like everyone's goes into it blind, discovers it for themselves, and comes out the other side like, whoo. So yeah, great to be able to discuss it with people and hopefully prevent too many more people going into it as blind.
Yeah, fantastic. Are there any other last quick questions? Because I'm aware in Central Europe it's already past work time, so otherwise we'll try to finish on time. Okay, there's no hands coming up. Claire, you've already answered a lot of questions, and shared a lot of your experience. So can I just say thank you very much again for that. Before everybody is running off, just let me post our quick evaluation link in the chat, because we do hope to improve these events as much as possible. If I can find the chat button now. Here we go. It's just a few questions, especially because we have 10 people here today, but we are trying to get these events out to as many people as possible. There's a little, I think the last question is about any improvement. So if you have any suggestions on how we can even more boost the engagement with these events so that we can grow this community of people who are interested in this topic, that would be much appreciated. So if you could just take a couple of minutes. Thank you very much again, Claire. And thank you, everyone.
Thanks for
enjoy
having me.
the end of your week, and see you soon, hopefully.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Claire. Bye.
Thank you, Felix. See you, Ian.
Thank you.
Bye, Aminul.